The rain wasn't just falling, it was weeping. A slow, gray, relentless weeping that had soaked the world for 3 days straight. It slicked the sidewalks of the tired little town of Briarwood, turned fallen leaves into slippery, decaying carpets, and seeped into the bones of anyone foolish enough to be outside. Like me, Eleanor Vance, 38 years old, standing on the cracked concrete porch of a house that didn't feel like home anymore, clutching a cardboard box filled with the last, dusty remnants of my father's life. October 15th, a Tuesday. The kind of day that feels like the universe itself is sighing, heavy and resigned. The air smelled of wet earth, decaying wood, and the faint, stubborn tang of chrysanthemums refusing to surrender to the gloom. Inside the box, old pipes, a tarnished pocket watch that hadn't ticked in decades, a stack of faded postcards from places Dad never visited. Just stuff. Heavy stuff. The tangible weight of absence. He'd been gone 6 months. A sudden, brutal stroke that left a silence in this old Victorian house so profound, echoed. I'd moved back from the city to sort through it all. This monument to a quiet, solitary life. My own life felt suspended adrift. The high-pressure marketing job I'd left felt like a distant, meaningless dream. Here, there was only the oppressive quiet, the ghosts of childhood memories, and the crushing responsibility of deciding what to keep, what to discard, of a man who'd spoken little and loved deeply in his own reserved way. Grief wasn't a sharp knife anymore. It was a dull, persistent ache, a constant companion in the empty rooms. I needed air. Even wet, weeping air. I set the box down just inside the door, grabbed my worn trench coat, and stepped out onto the porch. The rain hit my face, cold and cleansing for a second, before just feeling cold. I leaned against the peeling white column, watching water stream down the gutter spout, forming a muddy puddle near the overgrown rhododendron bushes at the corner of the porch. That's when I heard it. Not the rain, not the distant rumble of a truck on the wet road. Something smaller, fainter, a sound that didn't belong. A soft, rasping scrape, like claws on wood. Then, silence. Just the rain. I strained my ears, peering into the gray gloom under the bushes. Nothing. Probably just a branch. I started to turn back towards the door, the damp chill seeping into my sweater. Then, it came again. That rasp. And this time, a tiny, choked sound. A whimper? A sigh? Something wounded? Curiosity? Or maybe just the need to focus on something outside my own hollowed-out heart, pulled me down the porch steps. The wet grass soaked my canvas shoes instantly. I crouched, ignoring the damp earth soaking through the knees of my jeans, and peered into the tangled darkness beneath the rhododendron's dripping leaves. Eyes. That's what I saw first. 2 enormous, liquid pools of green, reflecting the dim porch light. Unblinking. Filled with a terror so profound, it stopped my breath. They belonged to a cat. Or the ghost of one. Huddled deep in the shadows, pressed against the cold brick foundation of the house, was a creature more skeleton than substance. Wet fur plastered tight to a painfully thin frame, ribs starkly visible even in the gloom. Mud caked its flanks, matting the fur into stiff spikes. One ear, the left one, was torn, a ragged notch missing. It didn't move, didn't hiss, just stared, frozen, utterly still, except for the faintest, almost imperceptible tremor running through its entire body. My own breath caught. The sheer vulnerability, the absolute stillness, it mirrored something inside me. That hollowed-out feeling, that instinct to just freeze and hope the world passes you by. "Hey there," I whispered, my voice husky, unused to speaking much these days. "Little one." The eyes just stared, unreadable, terrified. I didn't think. Instinct? or maybe just the overwhelming need to do something besides sift through the relics of death, took over. So slowly, I reached into the pocket of my coat. I always carried a small bag of dry cat food now. Mrs. Henderson's plump tabby, Mr. Pickles, had started visiting my porch shortly after I moved in, drawn by the scent of my solitary meals. He'd become a hesitant companion, a silent witness to my unpacking of grief. I shook a few kibbles onto my palm, the sound unnaturally loud in the rain-hushed air. Holding my breath, I extended my hand, palm flat, towards the shadowed space under the bush. Not too close. Just an offering. The green eyes flickered down to the food, then back to my face. The stillness deepened. The tremors seemed to intensify. Rain dripped from the leaves, landing on my hand, mixing with the kibble. Seconds stretched, thin and taut. I could hear my own heartbeat thudding dully in my ears. Then, the barest movement. Not towards the food, but a slight, almost imperceptible, tilt of the head. Just a fraction. As if assessing, weighing the terrifying unknown of me against the desperate, gnawing emptiness inside its own fragile body. The fear in those eyes didn't lessen, but something else flickered there. A raw animal need. A question. I stayed perfectly still. Water trickled down my neck under my collar. My knees ached from crouching. The world narrowed to this patch of wet earth, this trembling shadow, this outstretched hand holding a meager offering. The rain wept on, indifferent. The house loomed behind me, full of silent memories. But here, under this dripping bush, was a different kind of silence. The silence of a creature balanced on the knife edge of survival, staring into the eyes of another creature drowning in her own kind of loss. Minutes passed, or maybe only seconds. Time felt slippery, unimportant. Then, so slowly it was almost painful to watch, a single, skeletal paw emerged from the shadows. Thin, muddy, claws retracted. It touched the wet grass just beyond the bush's edge. Hesitated. The green eyes locked onto mine, searching, pleading, terrified. The paw stretched further, trembling violently. It hovered, millimeters from my fingertips, from the food in my palm. The cat's entire body was coiled tight, ready to vanish back into the darkness at the slightest wrong move. I held my breath. The rain drummed on the leaves. The scent of wet fur and earth filled my nostrils. This wasn't just about food. This was trust, offered from a place of utter brokenness. A tiny, fragile bridge being built over an abyss of fear. That trembling paw, hovering, felt like the most significant thing in the world right then. More significant than the dusty relics in the box on the porch. More significant than the echoing silence in the house. It was life, raw and desperate, reaching out. And in that moment, my own hollowed-out heart felt a quiet, almost imperceptible shift. A tiny spark, not of happiness, but of connection. Something was beginning. Something fragile and terrifying and utterly, completely necessary. Under a weeping sky, with a trembling paw suspended between fear and hope, something quietly, irrevocably changed. The trembling paw hovered. Raindrops splashed onto my open palm, blurring the small, brown kibble. The cat's green eyes, wide, terrified, locked onto mine. Not blinking, just waiting. The world shrank to this muddy patch beneath the dripping rhododendron, the cold seeping into my knees, the frantic drumming of my own heart. Time stretched, thin and fragile. One wrong breath, one sudden movement, and that bridge of tentative trust would shatter. Slowly, so slowly it felt like moving through thick honey. I lowered my hand another fraction of an inch. My fingers brushed the cold, wet grass. The kibble settled onto the damp blades. I didn't look away from those eyes. "It's okay," I whispered, the sound barely audible over the rain. Just food. My voice felt rough and used. The paw jerked back, a flinch, vanishing into the shadows. My heart sank. Too fast. Too close. The green eyes darted from my face, to the food, back to my face. The stillness returned, thicker now. Heavy with disappointment. I stayed crouched, water trickling down my neck, the ache in my knees deepening into a sharp protest. Giving up felt like surrendering a piece of myself I hadn't realized I was still fighting for. Then, movement. Not the paw, but the head. A slow, deliberate tilt. The cat leaned forward, just an inch, its nose twitching almost imperceptibly. The scent of the kibble, ordinary, dry, faintly fishy, cutting through the smells of wet earth and decay. Its gaze fixed on the small pile. The raw need, the desperate hunger, warred visibly with the terror. It was heartbreaking to witness. A silent battle waged under a dripping bush. Another agonizing minute passed. The rain lessened slightly, shifting from a weeping to a steady sigh. And then a blur. So fast I barely registered it. A skeletal head darted out, snatched a single piece of kibble, and vanished back into the deepest recesses of the shadows. Gone. Like a phantom. But the kibble was gone too. A breath I hadn't realized I was holding escaped in a ragged sigh. Relief, sharp and sudden, washed over me, mingling with the damp chill. It ate. It took the food. A tiny victory, fragile as a soap bubble, but it was something. Something real. Something happening now, not in the dusty past of the silent house behind me. I carefully shook out a few more pieces onto the same spot, a little further from me this time. "There you go," I murmured. "Just for you." Then, slowly, painfully, I pushed myself up from the muddy ground. My knees protested loudly. I backed away, step by careful step, not turning my back, keeping my eyes on the dark space under the bush. Those green eyes watched me go, unblinking, still filled with fear, but perhaps, just perhaps, a fraction less absolute. He became Shadow. Not a grand name, not a cute one. Just descriptive. Because that's what he was. A silent, watchful presence that existed on the periphery of my life, tethered only by the small offerings of food I left on the edge of the porch, just beyond the dripping rhododendron. Days bled into each other, gray and damp. Briarwood in late October was a study in melancholy beauty. Crisp mornings gave way to cool, overcast afternoons. The last stubborn leaves clung to the oaks, fiery bursts of orange and red against the leaden sky. The air smelled of wood smoke from distant chimneys, damp earth, and the sweet decay of fallen apples in neglected yards. Inside the Victorian, the silence was a physical thing. I moved through rooms like a ghost myself, sorting through my father's life, his meticulously organized toolshed, his collection of worn detective novels, boxes of photographs featuring a younger man I barely recognized, smiling beside a woman who was my mother, gone even longer than he was. Grief wasn't a tidal wave anymore. It was the constant drip of a leaky faucet in an empty house. A persistent reminder of absence. Of the conversations we never had, the questions I never asked, the love that was always present but rarely spoken. My only anchor to the present, my only proof that life, however fragile, persisted, was Shadow. Our routine was slow, tentative, built on increments of trust measured in kibble and distance. Every morning, as the weak dawn light filtered through the kitchen window, I'd fill a small ceramic bowl, one of Dad's chipped ones, the one he used for his daily oatmeal. I'd step onto the porch, the wood cold beneath my bare feet. The air, sharp and clean. I'd place the bowl precisely where I had the first time, just beyond the reach of the rhododendron's dripping leaves. Then I'd retreat inside, leaving the door slightly ajar. I'd sit on the bottom step of the staircase, just inside the hall, out of sight but able to see the edge of the porch through the crack in the door. I'd wait, sometimes minutes, sometimes half an hour, listening. The rustle of dry leaves skittering across the sidewalk, the distant crow of a rooster, the low hum of the refrigerator kicking on, and then the softest scrape, a whisper of movement. I'd hold my breath. First, only the eyes would appear. Huge, luminous green, scanning the porch, the door, the empty street, checking for threats. Then, the rest of him would materialize, low to the ground, belly almost brushing the damp wood. He'd slink towards the bowl, movements fluid yet tense, every muscle coiled for flight. He'd eat fast, ravenously, gobbling the kibble with a quiet, crunching urgency. Head snapping up between bites, ears swiveling, eyes darting. He'd drain the bowl in under a minute. Then he'd freeze, stare at the empty dish, stare towards the crack in the door where I hid. And then he'd melt back into the bushes, vanishing as completely as if he'd never been there. No sound, no meow, just silence and watchfulness. Evenings were a repeat. I'd place the bowl out just before dusk settled, thick and purple. The routine was the same. The silent approach, the frantic eating, the watchful retreat. But slowly, things began to shift. The increments were tiny, almost imperceptible, but I noticed. I noticed everything about him. It became my focus, my meditation against the silence of the house. He started appearing before I put the bowl down. I'd see those green eyes watching from the shadows as I opened the door. He'd wait until I retreated before emerging. The distance he kept while eating lessened, inch by inch. He stopped bolting the moment the food was gone. He'd linger for a few seconds, sometimes lifting his head, sniffing the air, looking towards the door. Once, after finishing, he sat. Just sat. On the damp porch, near the bowl. Not grooming. Not sleeping. Just sitting. Looking out at the darkening street. He looked impossibly small and impossibly weary. A profound loneliness radiated from him, a mirror to the hollow ache in my own chest. He wasn't just hungry. He was alone. Utterly, devastatingly alone. Like me. One drizzly afternoon, about a week after I first saw him, I tried something different. Instead of retreating inside immediately, I sat down on the top porch step after placing the bowl. I kept my body angled slightly away, my gaze fixed on the skeletal branches of the maple tree across the street. I didn't look at the bushes. I just sat, breathing slowly, feeling the cool, damp wood through my jeans. The silence stretched. Long minutes ticked by. I heard the usual sounds, dripping gutters, a car passing slowly on the wet road. But no scrape, no rustle. Had I scared him off? Pushed too far? Disappointment, sharp and familiar, pricked at me. Stupid. Too much, too soon. Then the faintest crunch. I didn't turn my head. Didn't move. But my peripheral vision caught him. He'd emerged. Closer to the bowl than ever before. He was eating, but his head was up more than down. His eyes weren't on the food, they were fixed on me. On my profile. Assessing. Calculating the risk. Every muscle in his thin body was tense, vibrating with alertness. He ate slower than usual. Deliberately. Watching me the whole time. I could feel the intensity of his gaze like a physical pressure. He finished the bowl. Instead of vanishing immediately, he took one slow, cautious step towards me. Then another. He stopped about 5 feet away. Close enough that I could see the mud still caked in the fur on his flank, the jagged tear in his left ear, the way his ribs still protruded painfully beneath the thin layer of damp fur. He sat down. Not relaxed, but he sat. And he looked at me. Not with the wide-eyed terror of that first night, but with a deep, solemn curiosity. A question hung in the air between us, unspoken but palpable. Why are you here? What do you want from me? I met his gaze. Slowly, gently. I didn't smile, didn't speak. I just looked back, letting him see me, the tiredness in my own eyes, the sadness I carried like a stone, the quiet loneliness that matched his own. It felt like an exchange, a silent acknowledgement of shared brokenness. We sat like that for a long moment. The only sound was the soft patter of rain on the porch roof and the rhythmic drip from the gutter. The gray light softened the harsh lines of his emaciation. His eyes, in that dimness, weren't just green. They held flecks of gold, like sunken treasure in a deep pool. They were ancient eyes, knowing eyes, eyes that had seen too much hardship, too much indifference. A gust of wind rattled the branches of the rhododendron, sending a shower of cold droplets onto the porch. Shadow flinched, a full body shudder, his gaze snapping towards the movement. The moment shattered. In a blur of wet fur and bone, he was gone, vanishing back into his sanctuary beneath the leaves. I sat there for a while longer, the cold seeping into my bones, the image of those ancient, knowing eyes burned into my mind. The silence of the house behind me felt different now. Not just empty, but waiting. And the connection, that fragile bridge built on kibble and shared solitude, felt suddenly, overwhelmingly real. He wasn't just a stray I fed. He was a presence, a silent witness to my unpacking grief. And in his wary, damaged way, he was reaching back. Not with a paw, not yet, but with his eyes. With his watchful, weary presence. He was teaching me patience, teaching me to be still, teaching me that trust, after devastation, is rebuilt one excruciatingly slow, silent moment at a time. The ache in my chest wasn't just grief anymore. It was the ache of something new, something terrifyingly vulnerable, beginning to unfurl. A connection forged not in words, but in shared silence and the profound, unspoken understanding of loss. The house loomed full of the past, but on the edge of the porch, in the damp, gray light, something alive, something present, was slowly, cautiously learning to trust. And so, this was I. The silent communion on the porch, Shadow's ancient, gold-flecked eyes meeting mine, became the fragile cornerstone of our existence. October bled into November, the fiery leaves surrendering to bare, skeletal branches that clawed at a perpetually gray sky. Frost etched delicate patterns on the window panes in the mornings, and the scent of wood smoke grew thicker, warmer, clinging to the chill air. Inside the Victorian, the silence remained, but it was no longer just an echo of absence. It was a space now shared, however tentatively, with a watchful, wary presence. Shadow's trust expanded, in increments as small and delicate as snowflakes. He stopped bolting the moment his bowl was empty. He began lingering longer on the porch, sometimes sitting, sometimes meticulously grooming a patch of fur on his flank, his rough tongue rasping against the slowly improving condition of his coat. The mud was gone, washed away by rain and his own attentions. The ribs were still prominent, but less starkly terrifying. He filled out, just a little, the hollows less deep. He was still painfully thin, but no longer looked like he might crumble to dust. The biggest shift came one bitingly cold afternoon. The weak sun offered no warmth, just a pale glare on the frost-rimed grass. I'd placed his bowl as usual and retreated to my spot on the top step, pulling my thick cardigan tighter. I'd brought a mug of tea this time, its steam curling into the frigid air. Shadow emerged from his rhododendron sanctuary, ate his fill, but instead of sitting watchfully nearby, he did something extraordinary. Slowly, deliberately, he walked towards me, not stopping 5 feet away, not stopping 3 feet away. He came right up to the step where I sat. He paused, his head tilted, those impossible green eyes fixed on my face. I held perfectly still, not even breathing. Then, with infinite care, he stretched his neck forward and gently, oh so gently, bumped the top of his head against my knee. It wasn't a nudge for attention. It wasn't a demand. It was a touch. A deliberate, fragile point of contact. A silent word. I see you. I'm here. My breath hitched. Tears, unexpected and hot, pricked my eyes. I didn't move my hand towards him. Not yet. But I lowered my head slightly, a silent acknowledgement. I see you too. He held the contact for a heartbeat, too, then retreated a respectful step, sat down, and began meticulously washing a front paw, as if the monumental act had been nothing at all. My knee burned where his head had rested, a tiny point of warmth in the vast cold. That touch changed everything. It was permission, tentative, easily revoked, but permission nonetheless. The next morning, when I sat on the step with my tea, Shadow ate, then walked directly to me and bumped my knee again. This time, I slowly, so slowly, uncurled my hand from around the warm mug and offered the back of my fingers, knuckles down, near the porch floor. Cat language. Non-threatening. He froze, stared at my hand, sniffed the air cautiously. His nose twitched. Then, the tip of his cold, damp nose brushed against my knuckles. A feather-light touch. He inhaled my scent deeply, a long, slow sniff that seemed to go on forever. He pulled back, considered, then leaned in and rubbed the side of his face along my fingers. Twice, leaving behind the faint, musky scent of cat. Marking me. My heart hammered against my ribs. This cautious claiming, felt more intimate than any embrace I'd known in years. It was trust, hard-won, etched in scent and tentative touch. He didn't purr. He never made a sound. But the way his eyes half-closed as he rubbed, the slight softening of the tension in his emaciated frame, spoke volumes. A silent purr. He began following me. Not inside, not yet. But if I went to the mailbox at the end of the cracked front walk, a small, gray shadow would detach from the porch and pad silently behind me, stopping at a safe distance, watching. If I sat on the old wrought iron bench under the bare maple tree, bundled against the cold, he would eventually appear, leaping lightly onto the other end of the bench. He'd sit, statue still, gazing out at the quiet street, sharing the space, sharing the silence. He became my silent shadow in truth, a quiet companion in the echoing emptiness of my days. One afternoon, while sorting through boxes in the drafty, dust-moted living room, boxes filled with my father's academic papers, brittle yellowed lecture notes, faded conference programs, I felt a familiar ache of loss mixed with frustration. Who was this quiet, meticulous man beyond the father who made perfect pancakes on Sundays and fixed broken hinges? The depth of my ignorance felt like a physical weight. I sighed, rubbing my temples, and walked to the large bay window overlooking the front yard. Shadow was there, not on the bench, but sitting upright, rigid on the frost-whitened lawn. His gaze wasn't fixed on the street or the house, but upwards, steadfastly upwards, towards the second floor, specifically towards the window of my father's study, the room I had barely entered since coming back, the room that felt most intensely his. Untouched, a shrine to silence. I watched Shadow. His tail was absolutely still, not twitching, not curled, held stiffly behind him. His ears were pricked forward, intensely focused. He wasn't just looking, he was watching, with an intensity I'd never seen in him before. Not fear, but concentration. A deep, unwavering focus. "What is it, Shadow?" I murmured aloud, fogging the cold glass with my breath. He didn't react, didn't flick an ear, just kept staring at that window. after a long minute, he slowly lowered his head, turned, and walked deliberately back towards the porch, vanishing beneath the rhododendron. Felt strange, ominous. The next day, the same thing happened. I was clearing lunch dishes when I glanced out the kitchen window. There he was, sitting in the same spot on the frosty grass, staring fixedly at the study window. Motionless, utterly absorbed. A cold prickle, unrelated to the weather, ran down my spine. It wasn't a bird on the roof. No squirrels scampered on the bare branches near that window. What was he seeing? Or sensing? The room behind that glass was just a room. A desk, bookshelves, a leather armchair, dust motes dancing in stagnant air. Later that evening, as I settled on the sofa with a book, a soft sound broke the quiet. Not the usual creaks and sighs of the old house. A rhythmic, persistent scratching, coming from the direction of the front hall. Near the foot of the stairs. Shut up. He was inside. He'd never ventured beyond the threshold before. Tonight, the door had been slightly ajar after I'd brought in firewood, and he'd slipped in, silent as smoke. Now he was sitting at the bottom of the grand staircase, not looking at me, but staring intently up the darkened steps towards the second-floor landing. And he was scratching, not at the door, but at the worn Persian rug beside the bottom step. Methodically, deliberately, digging his claws into the thick weave with slow, determined strokes. Scritch, scritch, scritch. Shadow! I called softly, setting my book down. He paused, glanced towards me, his eyes reflecting the lamplight, wide and strangely intense. Then he looked back up the stairs and resumed scratching. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It wasn't frantic. It was purposeful, focused, as if he was trying to unearth something buried beneath the rug, or perhaps beneath the house itself. Hey, stop that, I said a little more firmly, rising from the sofa. He stopped instantly, his body tensing. He looked at me again, then back up the stairs, a low, almost inaudible rumble vibrating in his thin chest. Not a growl, more like a hum of frustration or urgency. Then, tail low, he slunk past me, a gray wraith, and disappeared back out the slightly open front door into the cold night. I stood there, staring at the spot on the rug where he'd been scratching. The fibers were disturbed, pulled slightly askew. The prickle on my spine intensified. This wasn't random cat behavior. This felt directed. Connected to his fixation on the study window. Connected to this house, to my father's silent sanctuary upstairs. Curiosity, sharp and insistent, warred with a sudden, irrational unease. What lay up there? Beyond the dusty desk and the books? What had drawn Shadow's unwavering gaze? What did he sense, or know, that I didn't? The comfortable rhythm of our fragile companionship had fractured. The silent understanding was now laced with a subtle, unsettling mystery. The house, which had felt merely empty, now felt watchful, holding its breath. Guarding a secret Shadow seemed desperate to uncover. And his silent persistence, his strange scratching, his intense focus, was a question I could no longer ignore. The past, it seemed, wasn't content to stay neatly boxed away in the basement. It was scratching at the door, demanding to be let in. The scratching, that deliberate, unnerving scritch, 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 became Shadow's nightly ritual. Like clockwork. As soon as the old grandfather clock in the hall wheezed out 9 chimes, the gray specter would materialize inside the barely open front door. He'd pad silently across the worn floorboards, take his position beside the bottom step of the grand staircase, and begin. Not frantic, not destructive, just persistent, digging his claws into the thick, faded wool of the Persian rug with slow, focused strokes. Always staring up the darkened stairs, towards the study. as if trying to tunnel his way to whatever secret lay hidden above. The sound grated on my nerves, a physical manifestation of the unease Shadow's fixation had planted. The house felt different now. Less like a repository of quiet memories, more like a vault holding something breathing. The study door, always closed, seemed to pulse with its own silent energy. I'd find myself pausing outside it, hand hovering over the tarnished brass knob, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. What was I afraid of? Dust? Ghosts? Or the answers I might find to questions I'd been too afraid to ask while my father was alive? Shadow's daytime vigils continued too. Rain or pale winter sun, he'd sit sentinel on the frosty lawn, head tilted back, green eyes locked onto that second-floor window. Unblinking, utterly absorbed. It was more than curiosity. It was devotion, or obsession. The contrast between this intense, silent watchfulness and the tentative affection he showed me was jarring. When he bumped my knee now, or cautiously sniffed my offered fingers, it felt warm, real. But the moment his focus shifted to the study, he became a different creature. Remote, implacable. The tension coiled tighter inside me, a spring wound past its limit. The quiet sorting of my father's life, once a melancholic duty, became charged with an electric dread. Every box opened, every drawer pulled, felt like disturbing sacred ground. I found myself handling his things, his pens, his reading glasses, a half-finished crossword, with trembling hands. Grief was no longer a dull ache. It was a raw nerve, exposed, and Shadow's silent insistence was poking at it relentlessly. One bitter Tuesday, sleet rattling against the windows like thrown gravel. I finally snapped. Shadow had been at it for nearly an hour. Scritch, scritch, scritch. The sound echoed in the cavernous hall, drilling into my skull. I'd been trying to focus on organizing old tax documents in the dining room, but the relentless noise, the image of him staring, waiting, it was too much. I slammed the folder down. Papers scattered. Enough. My voice, too loud, too sharp, shattered the oppressive quiet. Just stop it. Silence. Immediate and absolute. The scratching ceased. I strode into the hall. Shadow was frozen beside the bottom step, crouched low, tail tucked tight. His eyes, wide, startled, met mine. Not with fear, but with a profound, almost wounded confusion. He'd been working, diligently, and I'd yelled. The betrayal in that green gaze, the sudden vulnerability, hit me like a physical blow. The anger evaporated, replaced by a wave of shame so intense it stole my breath. What was I doing? He was just a cat, a damaged, lonely creature acting on some deep, inexplicable instinct. He wasn't haunting me, he was trying to tell me something. Something he believed, with his whole feline being, was vitally important. Tears, hot and sudden, blurred my vision. Not just tears of frustration, but of exhaustion, of the crushing weight of unspoken questions, of the loneliness that had become my constant companion, and now, the shame of lashing out at the one living thing who'd offered me silent companionship. I sank to my knees on the cold floorboards, right beside the rug he'd been scratching, right beside him. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice sick, broken. "Shadow, I'm so sorry." I didn't reach for him. I just knelt there, shoulders shaking, the tears falling freely now, splashing onto the worn wool of the rug. The dam had broken. 6 months of held-back grief, the confusion over my father's quiet life, the terrifying uncertainty of my own future, it all poured out in silent, shuddering sobs. The house absorbed the sound, the only witness, this thin, scarred cat. He didn't run. He didn't flinch. He watched me cry, his head tilted, those ancient eyes reflecting my pain. Then, slowly, Cautiously, he moved. Not away. Towards me. He patted the single step separating us. He didn't bump my knee. He didn't rub against me. Simply sat down, right beside my folded legs on the cold floor. He pressed the entire length of his thin, warm body against my shin, leaning, solid, present, and then a miracle, a sound I'd never heard from him. A low, rumbling vibration, faint at first, then growing stronger. A purr. Not the loud, contented purr of a pampered house cat, but a deep, resonant hum, like the quiet thrumming of a distant engine. It vibrated through his ribs, through my leg up into my bones. A sound of pure, profound comfort. It was the most intimate gesture imaginable. This silent creature, this ghost cat who had known only fear and hunger, offering solace. Offering his own fragile strength. His warmth seeped into my chilled skin. His purr resonated in my chest cavity, a counterpoint to my ragged breathing. The tears didn't stop, but the edge of despair softened. The crushing weight shifted just a little. I wasn't alone. Kneeling on the dusty floor, crying over a rug with a stray cat purring against my leg, I felt a connection deeper than any word could convey. He saw my brokenness, and he stayed. He leaned in. Minutes passed. The sleet lashed the windows. The old house creaked. My tears subsided into shaky breaths. Shadow's purr remained, a steady, grounding presence. My gaze, blurred and swollen, drifted downwards. Down to the spot on the rug where he'd been scratching, where my tears had darkened the faded burgundy wool. The fibers were noticeably disturbed, pulled up, revealing glimpses of the dark floorboards beneath. Driven by a sudden, almost detached curiosity, I reached out a trembling hand. Not towards Shadow, but towards the rug. I hooked my fingers into the loosened fibers and pulled. A section of the rug about the size of a dinner plate lifted easily. It wasn't sewn down, just laid over the boards. Beneath it, the wood was dark, scarred, but there was something else. A faint, almost imperceptible, rectangular outline etched into the plank. Like a hidden panel. My breath caught. Shadow's purr intensified, as if he sensed the shift. He leaned harder against my leg. Heart hammering, the grief momentarily eclipsed by a surge of adrenaline. I traced the outline with my fingertip. It was definitely there. A deliberate cut. I looked around, spotted a heavy, brass letter opener on the hall table, a relic from my father's desk. I grabbed it, inserted the thin tip into the faint groove near one corner, and pried. With a soft, protesting creak of old wood, the small rectangular panel lifted. It wasn't a trapdoor to a secret chamber, just a shallow cavity, perhaps an inch deep, hidden beneath the rug. And inside, nestled in a layer of fine dust, lay two things. First, a small, old-fashioned key. Tarnished brass, intricate teeth, attached to a simple, faded blue ribbon. It looked like it belonged to a diary or a small lockbox. Second, a tightly folded square of thick, yellowed paper. Carefully, reverently, I lifted them out. The key felt cold, heavy with potential. The paper crackled faintly as I unfolded it, revealing not writing, but a drawing. A map, hand-drawn, in faded black ink. It depicted the house, our Victorian, with surprising detail. The porch, the rhododendron, the maple tree. But the focus, marked with a small, precise X, wasn't inside the house. It was outside, in the far corner of the overgrown back garden, near the crumbling brick wall, where an ancient, gnarled apple tree stood sentinel. I stared, uncomprehending. The key? A map? Hidden under the rug? Shadow nudged my hand with his head, his purr a soft rumble against my skin. He looked at the objects in my hand, then deliberately up the stairs. towards the study. His message was clear. This is connected. This is where it leads. The emotional storm, the breaking point, had passed. Not into calm, but into a charged, breathless clarity. The mystery wasn't just Shadow's fixation anymore. It was mine. Father, the quiet, reserved man, had hidden something. Something significant enough to warrant a secret compartment under the rug. Something Shadow, somehow, had known was there. Or sensed. Or remembered. The grief wasn't gone. But it was tangled now with a fierce, almost desperate need to understand. Who was Arthur Vance? What had he hidden? And what did this scarred, silent cat have to do with it? Shadow's unwavering gaze, his purse still vibrating against me, wasn't just comfort now. It was confirmation. The silent vigil, the persistent scratching, it hadn't been madness. It had been a guide. A key offered not in metal, but in trust, in purse pressed against a grieving woman's leg on a cold floor. The house, the past, it was no longer a closed book. The page had turned, revealing a cryptic map and the silent cat who had led me to it. The breaking point hadn't shattered me. It had cracked open the world. The real unraveling, the true journey into my father's hidden heart, was just beginning. And Shadow, my unlikely compass, was right there beside me. Purring. The cold floorboards pressed into my knees. The tarnished key and faded map lay heavy in my palm. Shadow's purr vibrated against my leg like a grounding wire. The storm of tears had passed, leaving behind a strange, hollowed-out calm, charged with a current of bewildered anticipation. The grief hadn't vanished, it had simply made room. Room for this impossible discovery, this silent collaboration with a scarred stray, this cryptic message from my quiet father. This is connected. This is where it leads. Shadow's unblinking gaze, fixed on the stairs, then flicking back to the objects in my hand, was a silent command. The map, the garden, the ancient apple tree. Vex. I pushed myself up from the floor. My legs trembled, partly from the cold, partly from the seismic shift that had just occurred within the walls of this silent house. Shadow rose with me, his purr subsiding into a watchful stillness. He didn't retreat. He stood beside me, tail held low but not tucked, his green eyes tracking my every movement. A partner in this, whatever this was. The sleet still rattled against the windows, a furious tattoo. Night had fully fallen, the hall lit only by the weak glow of the table lamp. Digging in the frozen back garden, in the dark, during a sleet storm, was madness. Practicality warred with the electric urgency humming in my veins. Vicky felt cold. The map, with its precise lines, the familiar shape of the house, the rhododendron bush where Shadow had first appeared, it was undeniable proof. My father, methodical, reserved Arthur Vance, had hidden something. And Shadow, impossibly, had known. Not tonight, Shadow, I whispered, my voice raspy from crying. Tomorrow. I needed time. Time to process the emotional earthquake. Time to let the shock settle. Time to look at that map in daylight, to understand the scale, to gather tools. To brace myself for what, or perhaps who, this key might unlock. I carefully folded the map, slipped the key onto its faded blue ribbon around my neck, tucking it beneath my sweater where it lay cold against my skin, a secret weight. I smoothed the disturbed section of the Persian rug back into place, hiding the cavity once more. The secret panel clicked shut. The physical evidence was concealed, but the atmosphere in the hall, in the entire house, had irrevocably changed. The silence wasn't just the absence of sound anymore. It felt charged, expectant, like the held breath before a symphony begins. Shadow watched me, his head tilted. Then he did something new. He didn't slink back out into the sleet. He turned, and padded deliberately towards the living room, towards the sofa where I'd been reading. He leapt lightly onto the worn cushions, circled once, and settled down, tucking his paws beneath him. His gaze, calm, steady, remained fixed on me. I'm staying. The implication was clear. The threshold, both literal and metaphorical, had been crossed. He was no longer just a porch phantom, a creature of the edges. He was inside, choosing to stay. In my space. The trust, solidified in that moment of shared breakdown on the floor, had deepened into something resembling belonging. Dawn broke, pale and tentative, over a world encased in ice. The sleet had stopped, leaving behind a glittering, treacherous sheen on every surface. Branches groaned under the weight of their frozen coats. The world looked fragile, beautiful, and bitterly cold. Inside, the Victorian felt different. Warmer, somehow, despite the chill radiating from the windows. Shadow was still on the sofa, a small, gray mound curled in a tight ball, fast asleep. The sight, so ordinary for a cat, yet so extraordinary for him, tightened my throat. He felt safe enough to sleep deeply, inside, near me. I moved quietly, making the ritual grounding me. The key pressed against my sternum beneath my layers. The map, unfolded now, lay on the kitchen table, weighted down at the corners by a sugar bowl and a jar of pens. In the clear gray light of morning, the details were sharper. My father's handwriting, small, precise. Labeled features: porch, maple, kitchen window. And the X, unmistakable, near the gnarled apple tree at the very back of the long, neglected garden. The scale suggested it wasn't buried deep, perhaps just beneath the surface, near the trunk. The practicalities took over, a welcome distraction from the churning emotions. Digging in frozen ground required more than hopeful curiosity. I rummaged in the cluttered toolshed, the scent of old oil and damp would triggering a flood of memories. Dad patiently showing me how to hold a hammer, the concentrated frown on his face as he planed a piece of wood. I found a sturdy spade, its handle smooth from years of use, and an old pickaxe, its head rusted but solid. Practical tools for an utterly impractical task. Bundled in layers, scarves, thick gloves, I ventured out into the crystalline world. The cold was breathtaking, sharp as knives in my lungs. Every step crunched loudly on the frozen grass. Shadow appeared silently at my side, slipping out the back door I'd left ajar. He didn't bound ahead, he walked beside me, matching my pace, his breath puffing small white clouds into the frigid air. His gaze, however, was fixed intently ahead, towards the back of the garden, towards the apple tree. The purpose was back, radiating from his small frame. The garden was a tangle of neglect. Frost-bleached stalks of long-dead flowers poked through the ice. Brambles, skeletal and threatening, clawed at the crumbling brick boundary wall. The ancient apple tree stood sentinel in the far corner, its twisted black branches coated in ice, looking more like a frozen explosion than a living thing. Beneath it, the ground was a mess of frozen leaf litter and gnarled roots protruding from the soil like arthritic fingers. According to the map, the X was near the base of the trunk, on the side facing the back wall. I scraped away the icy crust of leaves with the edge of the spade. The earth beneath was iron-hard, unforgiving. Shadow sat nearby, watching, utterly still except for the slight flick of his tail tip. His presence, silent and focused, was unnerving, anchoring. The first strike of the pickaxe jarred my arms, sending a shockwave up to my shoulders. It chipped away a small divot of frozen dirt. Progress was agonizingly slow, measured in tiny, icy shards. Chip, chip, chip. My breath labored, steaming in the air. Sweat prickled beneath my layers despite the cold. Shadow never looked away. He didn't offer to help, he just witnessed. His green eyes, reflecting the pale winter light, held an unnerving certainty. It's here. Keep going. Doubt not at me. Was this folly? Chasing a ghost cat's fixation and a decades-old map drawn by a man who spoke more through silence than words? Maybe the cavity under the rug was just an old repair? Maybe the map was a child's forgotten treasure hunt? Maybe I was projecting my need for meaning, for connection, onto random scraps and a stray's strange behavior. But then, the pickaxe struck something that wasn't dirt. Not rock, but something with a dull, hollow thunk. My heart leapt into my throat. Shadow's ears pricked forward, his body tensing. I dropped to my knees, ignoring the icy bite through my jeans, and scraped frantically at the loosened dirt with my gloved hands. Chip, scrape. There was metal. Tarnished, dirty, but unmistakable. A corner. Then another. A small, sturdy metal box. About the size of a thick book. My fingers trembled as I cleared the frozen earth from around it. It wasn't buried deep, maybe only 6 inches down, nestled amongst the tree's thick surface roots. It had a simple latch and, crucially, a keyhole. The tarnished brass key on its faded blue ribbon. It felt suddenly heavy against my chest. I fumbled with numb fingers, pulling it out from under my sweater, my scarf. Shadow inched closer, his nose almost touching the cold metal of the box as I brushed the last clumps of dirt away. His purse started, low and thrumming, a vibration I felt more than heard in the frozen stillness. I inserted the key. It slid in smoothly, a perfect fit. A soft, oiled click echoed in the silent garden as I turned it. The latch released. Holding my breath, ice crystals forming on my eyelashes. I lifted the lid. Inside, protected from decades of damp earth, lay layers of oilcloth. Carefully, reverently, I peeled them back. No stacks of gold coins. No bundles of cash. No glittering jewels. Instead, nestled in the cloth, were objects that punched the air from my lungs with a different kind of intensity. First, a small, oval locket. Tarnished silver, delicate chain. My fingers, clumsy with cold and emotion, fumbled with a tiny clasp. It sprang open. Inside, not a picture, but a tiny, perfect curl of fine, pale hair, tied with a microscopic blue thread. Baby hair. My baby hair? A memory, sharp and unexpected, surfaced. My father, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle, carefully snipping a curl when I was maybe 2. Mom laughing, capturing the moment with an old Polaroid camera. The photo was long gone, lost in moves or time, but the hair, he'd kept it. Hidden it. Beneath the locket, a bundle of letters, tied with a frayed red ribbon. The top envelope, addressed in a flowing, feminine hand I recognized instantly. To my dearest Arthur. My mother's handwriting. Letters I never knew existed. Letters written during their courtship, before I existed, filled with a youthful exuberance and tenderness so different from the quiet, settled parents I remembered. And beneath those, something that made a choked sob escape me. The smoke cosmos. Handmade, stuffed with something lumpy, one button I'm missing, the gray fabric threadbare. Mr. Squeakers. My constant companion from ages 3 to 7. I'd been convinced I'd lost him on a family trip to the beach. I'd cried for days. Dad had searched the dunes, fruitlessly. He'd never said much, just held me while I sobbed. And all this time, he'd had him. Rescued him? Found him later? Kept him safe, hidden away. A tangible piece of my childhood sorrow he couldn't fix, but could preserve. The fortune wasn't monetary. It was emotional. It was him. Arthur Vance, the quiet man, revealed not through words he never spoke, but through the things he silently cherished. the curl of his daughter's hair, the love letters from his wife, the lost toy of his grieving child. These were his treasures, hidden, perhaps, not out of secrecy, but out of a profound, inarticulate vulnerability. A fear that exposing such tenderness would make it, or him, seem less strong, less capable. Tears, hot against my frozen cheeks, streamed down my face again. But this time, they weren't tears of grief or frustration. They were tears of revelation, of a love so deep it had to be buried to be kept safe. Shadow pressed his head against my arm, his purr a constant, comforting thrum. He wasn't looking at the box, he was looking at me, as if he understood the magnitude of what lay in the frozen dirt. As if this connection across time, this understanding, was what he'd been guiding me towards all along. I sat back on my heels, the cold forgotten, clutching the locket, the letters, the ragged mouse. The winter sun, weak as it was, broke through the clouds for a moment, glinting off the ice-coated branches of the apple tree, casting fractured rainbows on the frozen ground. Shadow leaned his full weight against my side, warm, solid, present. The silence of the garden, broken only by his purr and my shaky breaths, wasn't empty anymore. It was full of memory, full of love, full of the quiet, enduring presence of the man who had been my father. The mystery of his fixation wasn't solved, not entirely. How had Shadow known? Had he witnessed my father burying it? Smelled the oilcloth? Sensed the emotional resonance? It didn't matter. Not really. He had been the bridge, the unlikely guide who led me not to riches, but to my father's hidden heart. Life hadn't magically transformed. The house was still full of boxes. My future was still uncertain. But the weight, the crushing weight of the unknown, had lifted, replaced by a profound, bittersweet gratitude. The past wasn't a closed door anymore. It was a conversation, whispered through a baby's curl, a love letter, a lost toy, and the unwavering gaze of a once starving cat. The treasure wasn't under the tree. It was the understanding, hard one, that love, even unspoken, even hidden, endures. And sometimes, it finds you, guided by the most unexpected companions, in the frozen ground beneath a gnarled old apple tree. Shadow nudged my hand, his purr deepening, a quiet rumble of shared contentment in the glittering, frozen stillness. We had found what we were both searching for. The frozen garden, the glittering ice, the weight of the small metal box in my hands, Shadow's purr vibrating against my side. It all coalesced into a moment suspended outside of time. The biting cold receded, replaced by a warmth radiating from the core of my being, fueled by the impossible treasures nestled in oilcloth. My hair, their letters, Mr. Squeaker's, not a fortune of gold, but a wealth of love, meticulously preserved, silently offered across the years by the father I thought I knew, but clearly hadn't known at all. We sat there, Shadow and I, for a long time beneath the gnarled apple tree. The weak winter sun climbed higher, melting tiny rivulets in the ice coating the branches, dripping like liquid diamonds onto the disturbed earth around the shallow hole. I traced the faded silver of the locket, the delicate chain catching the light. I didn't open the letters yet. The bundle felt too sacred, too immense to tackle amidst the frozen dirt. Just holding them, knowing they existed, knowing the depth of feeling in my mother's youthful hand, knowing my father had kept them safe, was enough. And Mr. Squeaker's, the ragged cloth mouse, felt achingly familiar in my palm, a direct conduit to a childhood grief I'd long forgotten, now transformed into a testament of paternal devotion. Shadow watched me, his green eyes calm, his purr a steady, grounding thrum. He seemed content. His intense vigil, the persistent scratching, the unwavering focus, it had culminated here. He hadn't led me to riches, but to reconciliation, to a profound understanding that quiet Arthur Vance hadn't been emotionally absent. He'd been fiercely protective, guarding his deepest tendernesses in the only way he knew how: by hiding them away. Shadow had somehow sensed that buried ache, that hidden love, and with silent, feline insistence, had guided me to unearth it. Back inside the Victorian, the atmosphere felt irrevocably altered. The silence wasn't oppressive anymore. It was expectant, reverent. I placed the small metal box on the cleared dining table, the locket, letters, and mouse carefully arranged beside it. Shadow followed me, no longer a tentative ghost, but a quiet companion. He explored the downstairs rooms with a new confidence, sniffing corners, rubbing his cheek against the leg of my father's old armchair, a silent claiming of space. He chose a patch of weak sunlight slanting through the bay window in the living room, stretched out, and began a thorough grooming session, the rasp of his tongue loud in the quiet house. The simple domesticity of it, the sound of a cat living here, filled the hollow spaces with a warmth I hadn't realized was possible. The next few days unfolded in a gentle haze. I read my mother's letters, slowly, savoring each word. They revealed a side of my parents I'd never glimpsed, playful, passionate, filled with dreams and anxieties about the future, about each other. Arthur wasn't just the quiet professor. He was the young man who wrote terrible poetry for his sweetheart, who worried about making her happy, who planned picnics with meticulous detail. My mother wasn't just the faded photograph on the mantel. She was vibrant, witty, deeply in love. The letters were a bridge, spanning the years, connecting me to the people they were before grief and time softened their edges. Mr. Squeakers took pride of place on my bedside table, a tangible piece of my childhood and a symbol of my father's quiet act of rescue. Shadow seemed particularly interested in the little mouse, sniffing it intently whenever he passed, sometimes gently batting it with a careful paw. As if he recognized its significance, a shared artifact linking past and present. One crisp afternoon, sunlight finally holding real warmth, I knew it was time. Shadow needed proper care. His torn ear, his lingering thinness, the years of hardship etched into his frame, demanded attention. The trust was solid now. He slept on the end of my bed, followed me from room to room, bumped my hand for strokes that sent his motor rumbling. Taking him to the vet wasn't just necessary, it felt like an act of commitment. An acknowledgement that this silent, scarred creature wasn't just passing through my life, he was part of it. Dr. Evans' clinic in Briarwood was small, familiar, smelling of antiseptic and warm fur. Shadow, predictably, transformed back into a statue of tension in the carrier. In the examination room, he pressed himself into the back corner, eyes wide, pupils dilated. But he didn't hiss, didn't growl. He just trembled. I kept my hand near the carrier door, talking softly, reassuringly. Dr. Evans, a kind-faced woman with gentle hands, understood strays. She moved slowly, speaking in low, soothing tones. The checkup proceeded with minimal drama. Shadow endured the poking and prodding with stoic stillness, only flinching slightly at the thermometer. Dr. Evans confirmed what was visible: malnourishment, healed fractures in his tail and one hind leg that explained a slight stiffness in his gait, ear mites treated with medication, and the torn ear, likely an old fight wound. "He's been through the wars, this one," she murmured sympathetically, running her hands over his ribs, now thankfully padded with a little more flesh thanks to weeks of regular meals. "But he's strong. Heart and lungs sound good. Remarkably good temperament considering." Then, as she gently lifted him to check his belly, her fingers paused. She shifted his thin fur, peering closely. "Well now, what's this?" she said, her tone shifting to curiosity. my breath caught. "What is it?" She carefully turned Shadow slightly, holding him steady. "Looks like a tattoo. Very small. Faded. But definitely a tattoo." She pointed to a spot low on his belly, near his hind leg. "See?" I leaned in. First, I saw nothing but pale skin and sparse fur. Then, as Dr. Evans angled him towards the light, I saw it. Tiny. Intricate. Faded to a pale blue-green, almost like an old bruise, but the lines were unmistakable. It wasn't a random blotch. It was a symbol. A small, perfectly rendered acorn. An acorn. The world tilted. Memories, sharp and sudden, flooded my mind. My father's workshop. The scent of sawdust and linseed oil. His large, calloused hands, surprisingly deft, carving intricate details into wood. And his signature mark, the one he'd burn or carve into every piece he made, from my childhood rocking horse to the elegant bookshelves lining his study. An acorn. A symbol of potential, of growth, of something small holding the promise of something mighty. "From little acorns, mighty oaks do grow," he'd say whenever I asked about it, a rare flicker of sentimentality in his usually reserved demeanor. On a cat. An acorn tattoo. "Oh my God." The words escaped me in a choked whisper. Dr. Evans looked at me, concerned. "Is something wrong?" No, I stammered, reaching out a trembling hand. Shadow, sensing my shift, pressed his head against my fingers. I traced the spot, feeling the faint, raised lines of the tiny acorn beneath his skin. It was real. It was my father's mark. His symbol. He put it on everything he made. Dr. Evans' eyes widened in understanding. Well, that explains it. Microchipping wasn't as common years ago, especially in small towns. Some folks, particularly those who valued craftsmanship or had signature symbols, sometimes opted for tiny tattoos on their pets. Easier to identify than a collar that could be lost, especially on an outdoor cat. She looked at Shadow with renewed interest. "This old fellow, he belonged to your father?" The pieces, the impossible, baffling pieces, slammed together with the force of revelation. Shadow hadn't sensed the hidden box through some mystical feline intuition. He hadn't smelled oilcloth buried under frozen earth. He knew. Because he'd been here. He'd belonged here. To Arthur Vance. The intense focus on the study window, the room where my father spent hours reading, planning, making things. The scratching at the rug by the stairs, perhaps the spot where he'd last seen his human, or where he'd waited for him. The immediate trust he'd shown me, not just because I fed him, but because I smelled like this house, like him. The way he'd pressed against my leg when I cried, offering comfort, perhaps remembering offering the same comfort to a grieving man after my mother died. The way he'd known about the hidden compartment, because maybe, he'd been there when Arthur Vance knelt to place the box beneath the rug, receiving a gentle stroke, a silent promise. Shadow wasn't a random stray. He was Arthur Vance's cat, his companion, his silent confidant in this big, echoing house. He hadn't been lost, he'd been waiting for his human to come back. And when Arthur didn't, he'd stayed. Surviving, watching, guarding the secrets, the treasures, his human had left behind. Until I came, and smelling of Arthur, of this place. I'd offered food and patience, and he'd recognized a fragment of the bond he'd lost. He'd guided me not just to a box, but back to his human, back to the love Arthur couldn't voice, but had poured into preserving these fragments of his heart. Tears streamed down my face, hot and silent. Not tears of sadness, but of overwhelming, profound connection. Shadow pressed harder against my hand, his purr escalating, a deep, resonant rumble that filled the small exam room. He looked up at me, those ancient green eyes, and in them, I saw no confusion about my tears. I saw understanding, a shared knowledge, a bridge spanning not just my grief, but his too. We had both lost Arthur Vance, and we had miraculously found each other. Dr. Evans smiled softly, a knowing look in her eyes. Seems like he found his way home in more ways than one. She gave Shadow a final gentle stroke. He's a special one, Eleanor. Take good care of each other. The ride home was quiet. Shadow sat in the carrier, no longer trembling. He watched me through the grate, his gaze steady, calm. The tiny acorn too, a mark of ownership, a mark of love, hidden beneath his fur, felt like the final, most precious gift. It wasn't just a symbol my father used, it was a symbol he had given to Shadow. A permanent claim. A silent declaration. This cat is mine. Back in the Victorian, the afternoon sun streamed through the clean windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. I placed the carrier on the floor and opened the door. Shadow emerged, stretched languidly, then walked, not towards the kitchen, not towards his sunny spot, but towards the grand staircase. He paused at the bottom, looking up towards the second floor, towards the study. But this time, there was no intense fixation, no rigid posture, just a quiet, contemplative look. Then he turned to walk to where I stood and bumped his head firmly against my knee. A familiar gesture, now imbued with a depth of meaning that took my breath away. I'm home. You're home. We're home. He then padded purposefully towards my father's old leather armchair in the living room, the one he'd rubbed against days before. He leapt up, circled once, and settled down, curling into a tight circle. He tucked his nose under his tail, closed his eyes, and let out a long, deep sigh. A sigh of utter contentment, of peace, of a long journey finally ended. I walked over, knelt beside the chair, and gently rested my hand on his side, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing, the faint vibration of his sleeping purr. My gaze drifted to the dining table, to the locket, the letters, the ragged mouse. And then back to the sleeping cat, Arthur Vance's cat, wearing his master's mark, finally at rest in his master's chair. The final gift wasn't in the box. It was the cat himself. Shadow wasn't just a guide. He wasn't just a companion. He was a living legacy, a testament to my father's quiet capacity for love, a love that extended beyond his human family to this silent, loyal creature. A love that had endured, hidden but steadfast, waiting patiently in the form of a scarred, starving cat beneath a rhododendron bush, to lead me back, not just to my father's secrets, but to the enduring truth of his heart. The fortune wasn't buried treasure. Was this circle of love completed? Arthur Vance's cat had brought his daughter home. And in doing so, he had finally come home himself. The purring bundle in the worn leather chair, marked by an acorn, was the final, most precious piece of the puzzle. The living, breathing gift my father had left behind. Winter softened into spring, but the transformation inside Briarwood's old Victorian house ran deeper than the thaw outside. The silence that once echoed with absence now hummed with quiet activity, the rustle of pages turning, the soft thump of a tail against leather, the rhythmic symphony of a cat's purr resonating through sun-dappled rooms. Shadow, no longer a spectral visitor but a creature anchored in belonging, moved through the space with the easy confidence of one who knows he's home. His favorite spot remained Arthur Vance's worn leather armchair, the supple leather molded by generations of contemplation now accepting the weight of a small, gray cat who wore an acorn tattoo like a badge of honor. Eleanor watched him often, the way sunlight caught the gold flecks in his green eyes as he drowsed, the slow, deliberate blinks he offered her, feline benedictions of pure trust. The frantic starvation had melted away, replaced by a dignified leanness. His coat, once matted and dull, now gleamed like brushed pewter. He'd gained weight, but more importantly, he'd gained ease. The trembling stillness was gone, replaced by a profound calm. He still followed her, to the kitchen while she made tea, to the study as she sorted through the remaining boxes, his silent presence a grounding constant. But the frantic vigilance, the desperate scratching, the intense stares at the second-floor window, they had ceased. The mission was complete. The treasures were found. The secrets whispered. The small metal box held pride of place on the mantelpiece now, flanked by a framed photo of her parents, young and laughing on a windswept beach, and Mr. Squeakers, the one-eyed cloth mouse. Eleanor opened the locket often, tracing the pale curl of hair with a fingertip, a tangible connection to a moment of pure, uncomplicated love. The bundle of letters, tied with their frayed red ribbon, resided in her father's old desk drawer. She didn't read them every day, but knowing they were there, the tangible proof of her parents' vibrant, hopeful love, was a constant warmth against the lingering chill of grief. They weren't ghosts anymore. They were people. Flawed, loving, dreaming people. Sorting through the remaining boxes became less an excavation and more a conversation. Each object, a chipped mug, a well-thumbed detective novel, a set of drafting tools, carried new weight. She saw her father's hands not just fixing hinges, but carefully carving the acorn symbol into the leg of her childhood desk. She saw the quiet man who meticulously preserved his wife's letters and his daughter's sorrow-soaked toy, finding space in his practical world for profound tenderness. The house wasn't a museum of absence. It was a testament to a life lived deeply, if quietly. Arthur Vance hadn't hidden his love away out of shame, but out of a fierce, protective reverence. He'd safeguarded it, like the treasures in the garden box, believing its vulnerability made it precious. Shadow, wearing that tiny acorn, was the living proof he'd been wrong. Love needed to be seen, to be felt, to be shared. One rainy April afternoon, Eleanor sat at her father's massive oak desk in the study. The door, now usually open, framed a view of the hallway where Shadow lay sprawled on the rug, bathing in a patch of gray light. She was sketching not blueprints or marketing strategies, but the curve of the apple tree's gnarled branches, the shape of the rhododendron bush. Her hand moved with an unfamiliar looseness. On a fresh sheet, she drew Shadow, the elegant arch of his back, the tilt of his head, the wise depth of his eyes. And in the corner, small but deliberate, she sketched an acorn. A soft thump made her look up. Shadow had risen and padded silently into the study. He didn't jump onto the desk as he sometimes dared now. Instead, he walked to the worn Persian rug near her feet, the very spot where he'd scratched with such desperate purpose, and lay down. He curled into a tight circle, tucking his nose under his tail, his gaze fixed not on the window, but on her face. His purr started, a low, resonant vibration that filled the quiet room like a contented heartbeat. It struck her then, with the gentle force of a revelation settling into place. This, the purring cat on the rug, the sketches on the desk, the locket warm against her skin, the memory of her father's hands carving wood, this was the true fortune. Not gold or jewels, but the intricate mosaic of connection. The love her father had preserved in objects and silence. The love Shadow had guarded with fierce loyalty. The love she was now learning to hold and to express without fear. Loss hadn't vanished. The ache for her father, for the conversations they'd never have, still surfaced, sharp and sudden sometimes. But it no longer drowned her. It was woven into the fabric of her life now, a dark thread making the brighter colors more vibrant. Shadow hadn't erased the grief, he'd shown her how to carry it. How to let it coexist with warmth, with presence, with the quiet joy of a purring cat in a sunbeam. He was the bridge between the silent man and the daughter who needed to understand him. He was the keeper of secrets who became the catalyst for revelation. He was proof that love could endure in the most unexpected vessels: a scarred stray, a hidden key, a faded map, a curl of baby hair. The message wasn't shouted, it was whispered in the rhythm of their days. It was in the way Shadow now greeted her at the door when she returned from the small freelance design jobs she'd started taking, a soft chirp escaping him unheard of months before. It was in the way she found herself talking to him as she worked, sharing fragments of her day, knowing he listened with his whole being even if he didn't understand the words. It was in the shared silence, rich and comfortable, as they sat together in the evenings, her reading, him drowsing, the ghosts of the house no longer haunting, but resting. Healing wasn't a destination, Eleanor realized. It was a landscape you learned to inhabit. A landscape shaped by patience, by unexpected guides, by the courage to unearth hidden things. It was learning that grief and gratitude could share the same space. That love didn't die with the loved one. It transformed, seeking new channels, new companions. Shadow was that companion. Not a replacement, but a continuation. A living legacy of her father's quiet, steadfast heart, wearing its symbol on his skin. As spring deepened, the gnarled apple tree in the back garden burst into a cloud of fragile pink blossoms. Eleanor stood at the study window, watching petals drift like snow onto the spot where the metal box had lain buried. Shadow joined her, leaping lightly onto the wide windowsill. He pressed his side against her arm, a warm, solid presence. Together, they watched the blossoms fall. The journey hadn't been about finding a lost fortune. It had been about finding him, her father, revealed in his hidden tenderness. And finding herself, no longer adrift, but rooted in understanding, in this old house full of whispers and love. And finding Shadow, who was never truly lost, just waiting faithfully for his world to be whole again. He turned his head and looked up at her, those ancient green eyes holding a depth of knowing that still took her breath away. He blinked slowly, a deliberate, loving gesture. She blinked back, the corners of her eyes crinkling with a smile that felt as natural as breathing. She rested her hand lightly on his head, between his ears, feeling the soft fur, the solid bone beneath. His purr rumbled, a deep, contented sound that vibrated through her palm, up her arm, and settled warmly around her heart. Outside, a breeze stirred the apple blossoms, sending another shower of pink drifting to the earth. Inside, the silence was perfect. Not empty, not echoing. Full of memory cherished, not feared. Full of love discovered, not buried. Full of the quiet, purring presence of a cat who had led her out of the gray and into the light. The fortune was never gold. It was this peace, this belonging, this circle of love, finally closed, with a scarred gray cat at its heart, wearing an acorn like a promise kept. The petals fell. The cat purred, and the house, once filled with echoes of loss, sang softly, with the quiet, enduring music of home. If this story resonated with you, if Shadow's journey touched your heart, don't miss tomorrow's tale. Subscribe, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and ring that notification bell, because stories of hope, healing, and unexpected connections await you every single day. Your support helps us share more light. See you in the next story.